So what we're doing here is we're doing a leafing hammer, the general purpose leafing hammer. And it is, this is for the level 2 grill, as Victoria mentioned. You're going to need this for the level 3 leaf work for the water leaf. And I'm just trying to follow along as faithfully as possible with the curriculum as it's laid out. If you want to get your curriculum at CBA and then at the national level, we're going to try to make sure that there are more benchmarks for your success in terms of advancement through the curriculum. So we'd like to see that it's not just about the final projects. So we're starting with 2 feet of 1 inch square bar. That is so that you can handle it and you can work off the end. You're going to need a slot punch, through and through drift, and a large drift, and a bolster, which is optional, but I would say is definitely worth the time to make, and you won't regret doing so. The slot punch, the through and through drift, and the large drift. Those are all very appropriate if made out of, say, 4140, 4130. I would go for 4140 myself. Where did? All right, there we go. The hammer eye drift and sizing, we're going to sort of reverse engineer this from a hardware store handle. Now, at the end of the tutorial tonight, I have shown how to do a handle from a piece of hickory, which you can cut into billets or staves, and you can shape entirely from scratch. It's a lot more cost effective, and I always end up doing a lot of work to my handles anyway, so it ends up working better for me. So you're going to start with the finished product, or the finished eye size in mind. In this case, you're looking for about maybe 1 inch to 1 inch and a 1/16 on the long axis. And actually, let me just get a spotlight on this here. Do I have a spotlight? On the long axis here, where the wood wedge will go, that's 1 to 1 and 1/16, and then on the short axis of the handle, you're looking at about 5/8. So working backwards from there, you have to have room to do all of the operations that you need and arrive at this finished size. And you don't want to be over, because then it's you've just wasted a lot of effort, and then you have to have a new handle anyway and a much bigger eye than you were intending. So you're going to start with a through and through drift. And this is something I like to do if I'm working on the end of a bar. So I make hammers with strikers, I make hammers by hand, I make them on tooling. When I'm working off the end of the bar, I like to have a through and through drift. The reason being is because I'm holding the bar in my left hand, and then that frees my hammer hand up for work. I don't need to manage the drift as well. If I'm doing a striking arrangement, or working on on some tooling, I might have a handheld drift. My billet will be secured on the drift. I'm using the drift as a mandrel, and then I'm able to use the drift to steer the metal while I hammer. And then I'm holding in tongs when I'm not working. I'm holding the billet in tongs when I'm not working off of the handheld drift. The finished drift will then size up from that. So this starts as 3/4. You flatten it out and it ends up about 1/2 by 7/8, somewhere around that. And then you've got a finished drift that's larger than that and also has a taper, and you finish it off with the finished drift. This is also designed to forge on a section that has parallel sides, and you can forge on that. And you won't, but if you do that, you don't have an hourglass shape in your eye. The hourglass shape to your eye, which holds the handle securely, is done at the end with the through and through drift. Moving to the next section here, we're going to talk about layout. So you're going to start with your 1 inch square bar. You're working off the end of the bar. So this would be you at this end. You have the end of the bar here. You put your punch at 2 5/8. The slot punch itself will be about 1/8 inch thick, and it will be about 7/8 inch long. That matches your through and through drift approximately. You're going to punch with the heel of the slot punch on the dot, So by the time you measure to end of stock from this side, again, that was 2 5/8. You have your 7/8 inch punch. You subtract that, you end up with about 1 inch and 7/8 to the end of the bar. This is just so that you get the appropriate weight and proportions. It's a little important to make sure that you do your layout well from the start. This looks like it's out of sequence. The punching, when you're done, you're going to compress the metal down to nearly the bottom of the stock. And when you do so, you're going to see some work hardening and evidence on the backside of the stock. And you're going to back punch that. Some people call this a bullseye. Some people call it a halo. And you're going to punch the majority of the punching with this style of punching from the top side, and then back punch the last little bit through, and that'll remove your slug. And again, this is mild steel. We're going to case harden this. Back punching the slug out, it's one thing that is good to think about. You have the slug here and you have your punch here. And there's a little bit of a relationship between the size of the punch and the size of the slug that you're trying to punch out. The punch, again, is 7/8 by 1/8, so it's only 1/8 of an inch thick. If you try to force an overly large slug out, you're going to force your punch to work a little bit harder. So in general, I try to have my slug thickness by the time I'm done no thicker than whatever the width of my punch is. So in this case, it's an 1/8 inch wide punch, and I don't want to try to clear out any more than 1/8 of an inch. So you're getting pretty close to the bottom when you do this. It's important when you're doing your layout, especially at the beginning. This is one area where you really want to take some time. If you end up off center, what happens is you have more resistance on one side, on the thick side, than you do on your thin side. And because this side is resisting, the majority of the distortion in the stock will occur on the thin edge. So you're going to get a bulge occurring on the thin edge, and the thick edge will stay put for the most part. That's not the end of the world. You can correct this. This is sort of a cutaway line drawing of how you go about doing this. Assuming that you're working in a coal forge, this would be your solid fuel here. You put the thick side down and a bottom draft, assuming you're on a bottom draft forge. And the bottom draft forge is going to act like a big torch heating from the bottom with the blast going up. So you're going to have more heat on the underside than you will on the top side. So what you're doing is you're using the same sort of principle. You're trying to get the thick side to be able to move. And when you drive your drift through, you want the thin side to stay put, which is the opposite of what happened when you have your punch off center. The other way that you can mitigate that a little bit is you can have a watering can, and in addition to heating the thick side, you can also cool the thin side. And to do that, the best way is to put the edge of your punch a little bit off parallel with the ground, so that the water will run off of it if you pour on that inside edge, and you pour it right down the inside edge so that it spills out only on the thin side, cooling that side. This is beginning the video for the layout. And so again, it's 2 5/8 is the mark. If you're not used to looking for center of stock eyeballing, you can take an open end wrench, which is half the thickness of the stock. In this case, it'd be a 1/2 inch open end wrench. And you score from either side, and where the two either meet in the middle, or sometimes if there's a little bit of a gap, you're going right in that gap. Then you center punch, and I always lead with the heel of my tool. That gets my positioning appropriately centered off of the center punch mark. And then I want to take some time right here to make sure it's in the center, and I'm looking from the edge to the edge of the line, edge of stock to the edge of the line, and then the other side, edge of the stock to the edge of my tool impression. And I want those to be equal distances. And once I've decided that I have a good position, then I'm going to commit. If I don't have a good position, I want to make a correction before I've driven that drift, because I have an opportunity to make changes before I get any depth. I'm going to, I generally like to do 2 hammer blows when using a handheld punch. I'm sorry, 3 hammer blows. And in between every hammer blow, I like to cool my punch, and I like to turn my punch so that it's turned a full 180 degrees. And you can see that I do that every time that I cool it. You can see I spin the punch in my fingers. I use my hip a little bit to steady it and get a good position. And what that does is it ensures that I punch an even hole. I'm using a hand forged and a hand ground punch. And if it has irregularities, if I don't spin it, those irregularities can steer the punch. By turning it, I equal that out. Now, what I've done here is I'm going to stop right there and describe what I did. I compressed all the way through. I bottomed it out, and you can start to feel feedback from your anvil, and you can hear it. You're going to hear the pitch increase in pitch to a higher pitch, where you can hear the anvil ring a little bit more, and you can feel the feedback through your hammer. Your hammer is going to have more rebound because it's going to have rebound traveling through your punch up into your hammer. So you can feel your anvil's feedback as you're getting close. And when you do that, you're going to have a little bit of a bend in the stock, which I like to take out. When I turn it around and I straighten it out, I'm very clear not to forge it. And when I have that opportunity, I very lightly take any sort of pucker or any kind of distortion out of the backside of the punch, and I push it back in. And it helps to work harden the steel a little bit. And that helps for the slug to shear out better. But you'll lose your halo. So what I've done is I've cleaned it up, and now I got to get my halo back. So I'm going to do another hammer blow or 2, maybe 3, and that will bring my halo back, and it will give me a good impression of where I need to back punch. That kind of keeps things a lot more tidy, and it makes clearing your slug a much easier affair. Again, I want to make sure my positioning is good. So I don't want to commit before I know that I have a good spot. I have my halo as a reference, but I want to get a tool impression, and I want to check it before I commit. There's my slug, there's my hole, and it turned out pretty well in the center and pretty straight. I want to see that it's not only in the center, but I don't want it steering towards the edges of the stock.
So John, we have one question.
Sure.
Can drifts, Bill Casper's asking, can the drifts and punch be made of sucker rods successfully?
Absolutely. Sucker rod, depending on the grade, will usually be 4140 or 4130. You can find, I believe Mark Asprey has posted a resource to be able to identify the code off of the knuckle. It has a square knuckle that the ends of the sucker rod screw together, and they're all stamped with a number, and you can find out the exact alloy. But they're generally chromoly, so it's a very affordable way to get chromoly. And if you guys don't have access to that in your area, you can look for places that do agricultural fencing. In my area in Oakdale, which is just about an hour and a half south of Sacramento, we have a place called Conlin Supply, and the last time I checked, you can get 1 inch for $15 for a 30-foot section, which is pretty affordable chromoly. And I think it's $12 for 3/4, and somewhere in between for the 7/8. So it's a really economic way to get your stock for hand tools. It's not the best, but it's really good and it's really good for tongs too. I use a lot for that. Any other questions before we move on?
Nope, I think we're
Kellen
good.
had a question. What type of steel is the slot punch made from?
Also chromoly. I tend to use new stock anytime that I want to make a tool that I intend to last for a long time, just because I'm very sure of what I'm using. My punch, I think, is in this is 4140, but a lot of my punches are actually sucker rod. The thing is, if I don't know if If I don't know exactly what kind of sucker rod it is, it could be 4130, and that's fine. It holds up well. It's more with this about the chromium and the molybdenum make it a little red hard. It's pretty reasonable for a lower grade of steel in terms of hot work. And it's very safe and easy to heat treat too.
Okay, I think that was it for the moment.
All right. And often I should say, sometimes very often I don't heat treat it at all. For these punches, I often will just do a little bit of a water quench on the end, but most of my chrome moly steel punches and drifts, they have no heat treatment whatsoever. I rely on having good technique to keep my business end from becoming affected from heat. And the easiest way to do that is don't let it get hot. You know, you get it in and out of the stock before you get a transfer, and you keep the heat in your billet or in your workpiece where it should be, instead of transferring it into your punch as a heat sink, and then you don't have your punches getting really messed up. So it's better to get them in, get them out before they ever take any color. Good questions. I'm glad you guys brought those up, because I wasn't actually thinking about that. Okay, so now we're going to work on the peen side. The peen end of this hammer is going to be both hammer faces will be about 3 inches long as measured from the edge of the eye. So right now I've got 1 7/8 from the edge of the eye forward. So I've got to grow that about 1 1/8 inches by the time I'm done. And the business end of this face of the hammer, the peen of the hammer, will be 1 inch wide by 3/8 of an inch thick. So I know that it's going to be 1 inch by 3/8. And if you know good forging practice, you don't want to try to forge rectangular bar stock on edge the hard way. If it's outside of a 3-to-1 ratio, what happens is it tends to do what I call curtaining, where it will sort of collapse and it'll kind of do an S curve on you, or it'll mushroom. And oftentimes it'll mushroom on both faces and it'll create an hourglass cross section. So if you want it to remain good parallel edges and keep pushing that stock towards the center without a lot of stock distortion, you stay at that 3-to-1 ratio. Well, I know that I'm going to exceed that if I go to 3/8 first. If I go to my 3/8 inch width, then I'm already at 1 inch. And as soon as I exceed that, when I try to bring it back to 1 inch, I'm going to be having to struggle a little bit. So what I'm going to do in advance, this is some forward thinking, is I'm going to narrow that end so that by the time I bring it to its 3/8 inch dimension, it will widen to the desired end. So I'm going to bring that down roughly to 3/4 of an inch. And by the time I bring it to this stage on the bick and take it to 1 inch wide, it will be about 1 by 3/8 by the time I'm done. So again, 3/4 of an inch here. Now, I like to have good methodical approaches to my forging. I want to have start and stop points. So I've already planned for where my one stop point is here. I've taken the weight out of the end of the hammer so that I can have it end up at the finished proportions. And now I have this other point. And I'd like to have a point A and a point B that I'm working between when I go to actually do the majority of my draw. So this transition here will be roughly 3/4 of an inch square to get good proportions. And then it will blend out in a reverse taper here. And I want to support my stock so that the support point ends right where the underside of the eye is. And then I want to aim with the heel so that that heel ends up this side of the eye. And I want to match my radius of my rounding hammer to my horn so that they have a similar radius. And another thing that's worth mentioning is that because I'm going to be working on a horn, I am working on a cone, so I can't square my stock in line with the anvil. I need to look at the horizon line on the apex of the far horizon line of my horn as viewed from the top. And I need to turn my stock so that it's perpendicular. If you don't understand what I'm saying when I say that, there's some very good visual representations in Mark Asprey's books of how to keep your stock square when you're forging on the horn. That's kind of earlier content. Hopefully, if you gotten it before level 2. If you have any questions, maybe approach that at the question and answer section. You start with the eye in an up-down position, because if you turn it this way, you have no idea where it is. So you get a tool impression here when you can have a visual on your eye. Make sure that you're not ruining your eye. And then once you've got that visual impression, you're going to turn your stock the 90 degrees that you need to do the same thing, lining up your heel of your hammer with the similar point. So you basically draw some lines here on your stock using your hammer. I like to keep my stock tidy when I'm forging, and I find that I have a much nicer end product visually if I work on chamfering my corners early on. I can always bring them back to a square corner, but once you've started to get them square, any evidence of your forging will show up immediately, because it's easy to read a line that runs off when it's perfectly square. Any kind of deviation from straight is very apparent. You can kind of blend a lot of that out and soften it up by chamfering your corners. You're going to draw the peen end once you've gotten your transition, where you've essentially forged this to about 3/4 of an inch. You're going to turn it to get your 3/8 of an inch business end, and you're going to work to connect your points A and points B so that you have straight transition lines. I like to do that on the horn. It's effective, and then you're going to have some finish work to clean up your lines. In addition, you will not have worked your edge. You will only have worked the top and the bottom. So you've got to clean up your edge on the anvil face here. If you don't want to have a bunch of edge marks on your work, you want to have a good radius edge on your anvil. Good 1/4 inch, I would say, at least is good. And you want to make sure that all of your transitions out of your eye, any curve that you have, an interior curve, a concave curve, you want to keep that off the edge of the anvil. Otherwise, you're going to get anvil marking. And when you get this particular edge, a better way, a good way to angle your hammer back to get this reverse taper is to drop your center of gravity at your knees. In other words, squat a little bit at your knees to lower your entire center of gravity so that you can angle your hammer handle down and maintain a good working position. This is the video of me doing these steps. We're going to start by taking the weight out of the end. You want to turn your stock after doing, say, a similar amount of hammer blows or similar amount of forging. You want to turn it so that you're working opposing edges. In this case, I was only working on the top and the bottom, so I was doing 180 degree turns. I'm going to take that to 3/4 of an inch. And now I'm going to start by aiming my heel of my hammer so that my hammer blows terminate right about the end of the punch. I have a visual reference for that, so I'm going to turn it to the sides, and I'm going to make sure I turn 180 degrees in between each hammer blow. I like to take my corners off early. It just keeps work tidy, and you can see where your material is. Now, when you start to get to the forging, you want to make sure that you're turning your stock 90 degrees and hit every single edge equally. If you're working in 2 opposing edges like this, you want to turn it 100 degrees, and you can see on this view that it forges a trapezoid. Let me just take that back just a little bit here. See how the edge is wider on the in this case the top here, but it will widen out on the hammer side. You can see it's wider here, and then you can see this edge widen and it becomes equal to the one that was on the bottom. If you only just hammer from one side only, that trapezoid will persist in your work, and you'll have a hard time bringing it back to square. So it's important to understand that the top side, the side that has that's getting the force delivered, will have a greater amount of forging done to it than the side that has rebound force. The rebound force has some diminishment to it. And then you're going to clean up all your edges. You can see by taking those corners off early on, it's very easy to see where your stock is, and you have a very good, visual reference for where you need to continue forging. I'm keeping in mind this whole time where I want my finished dimensions to end up. Again, I want it to be 3 inches from the edge of the eye to the end, and I'm looking for 3/4 inch transition here, 3/8 of an inch wide or thick by 1 inch wide. A little bit of fiddling, I think, is okay. If you take a little bit of time without being too too particular, too much of a perfectionist, it's a good thing to take a little bit of time to clean it up. Sometimes you don't have an opportunity to go back and revisit these things. Sometimes you do, but I like to do that work at the end of the heat, especially if I'm working on mild steel, as I am. Going to interrupt myself here. I was looking for 1 inch by 3/8. And I think it's good to mention, you want to forge everything deliberately and with intention. And it's okay if you don't get a hammer that's exactly to the dimensions and specifications that you're looking for. But when you give yourself a goal and you're actually forging to a specification, you have a measure to see how you're progressing, and it really elevates your skill set. And in addition, you get the tool that you were intending to get, not something that's a resemblance of that. So I'm just going through here, and what I'm doing is, you can see I'm finding the bottom, the horn. I'm making sure I'm very particular about getting placement on the bottom so that my stock is supported, and I'm hitting all 4 sides. I'm matching an equal or equivalent curvature with my hammer here, and I'm going to work on my transitions first, and I'm going to clean all of those up, starting with the corners going to the flats, and make sure I have a really nice transition. And then the job from that point is to make sure I don't put any marks into my transition when I blend in my straight lines, my flat lines here. And that last little bit of a black heat polish, really can help keep your stock clean. You can see there's a little bit of a pinch here on the eye, and that's okay as long as your through and through drift can make it into the slot punch. I would say that's probably desirable to have just a little bit. That means that you were really lining up your hammer blows appropriately so that you're very close to your eye. If you're doing that, you're setting yourself up to have success with having a very nicely proportioned cheek, because the cheeks are going to be to a specification as well. And this is a little bit of fiddling. I wanted to keep this in there because I think that being particular about your work is a good thing, as I said, as long as you're not taking an excessive amount of time to do that. And this part, I'm basically just checking my dimensions, making sure that I'm forging to the specifications. Oh, sorry. Okay, so that is going to finish the peen side. And now I've got to do the hammer face side. I'm going to do the same exact thing as I did to transition out of the eye here. I want a balanced visual effect from my forging from this side to this side. Even though it's not the same face, I want to make them look like they match each other, even though they're dissimilar, right? So to do that, I'm going to have a similar amount of forging transitioning out of the eye. That also helps to keep my eye, when I forge that, symmetrical. So this is going to go to 3/4 of an inch, and you're doing the same thing, but now you're pushing your stock to the offside, and now you're leading with the toe of your hammer. All of the other setup is pretty much just a mirror image of what you did with the peen side. Again, you're going to start with the hammer in an up down position. That gives you your visual reference, so that when you turn it, you know where you're going to aim your hammer blows here and where you're going to position your stock here. I'm just going to go back first to just show that's where you start with the up down position, and then move to the position with the hammer eye going horizontally to the ground. Same thing, you know, you're going to try to keep your concave transitions off of the edge of the anvil. Otherwise, you're going to get edge striking. I get a few on my hammer in the video, and then I have to go back to clean them up. And it's not a big deal, but if you can avoid it, that's better. And now you're going to transition this one. Of course, it's working off the end of the bar. So you need to terminate your reverse taper here for the face when you've achieved a 3-inch reverse taper as measured from the edge of this eye. So from here to the 3-inch cutoff, you want to have straight lines that your cutoff will be the starting stock, the original stock size, so 1 inch square. That will eventually give you a hammer that's about 7.5 inches long when you're finished. So we're just going to do the same. You want to make sure you're getting your position on the horn, match your radius of your hammer, get a visual reference. In this case, it's a little bit better representation of turning 90 degrees with each forging. I usually will hit all of my flat sides, and then I'll hit my corners. It actually makes it a little easier to reference your size of stock. And then go back to the flat sides. And then you want to check and make sure that you're in the ballpark. I think in this case, I needed to do a little bit more work, so I came back with a second heat. Again, you can see my toe really dives in there, and I'm leading with my toe of my hammer, and also the plane of my hammer handle is tilted so that my toe is a little bit forward. I'm leading with that edge. And I'm going to bring it up onto the face of the anvil, and I probably could have done a better job of keeping this underside supported. I would have gotten a more gradual taper. I fixed it later on, but again, you know, pointing out some of the things I could have done better. I also got some edge marks because I brought it a little bit too far onto the face, and that meant I had to do a little bit of cleanup. So, and you can see my stock kind of bends a little bit here in both the previous video on the peen and this video here. I have to straighten out my stock, which I do right here by hitting on the off side of the peen, make sure that it's all in line. And then I have to come back and I need to clean up those edge marks. In this case, I think I also take the opportunity to match my two sides. I've gotten forging on both sides now, so now I can make a comparison between the two, and I can see whether or not they're actually equal to each other. And one thing that is nice to see here is that you can see how uniform my forging becomes as I continue to work on these. You can see how it really cleans up all of the transitions of the stock. Taking the lumps and bumps out now enable me to have a clean forging without having to worry about it when I draw my cheeks out. If I don't come in here and get particular about cleaning all of this up, I have a mass here that is not uniform in its size, one side from the other, or its profile, one side to the other. So you're trying to make a nice circular cheek. And the only way that you can finish a nice circular cheek is if you start out with an equal amount of mass and have an equal draw as you go. So that's a lot of what I'm doing here. I'm making sure that I'm prepping my stock for the next step. That's a particularly good example there. And then I have to do a little bit of cleanup on the other side to do the same. And really, even though this looks like it's a step for the faces, at this point, I really am leading into prepping for the next step, which is to start drifting and drawing the cheeks. So that's a little bit more of what I'm trying to do here.
John, we have a question. Are there any
Sure.
pros and cons about doing this with a gas forge as opposed to a coal or a coke forge?
I would say gas is great. It's convenient. It's maybe a little bit more convenient and accessible for people that live inner city, or certain cities have restrictions on burning coal. So there's that. That's one thing. It's a little bit more portable as well. Downside of gas, outside of, you know, having available fuel and the things I just mentioned, is that you're going to get a more general heat. You're probably going to have more scaling, more loss of stock through scaling, and maybe not as clean a finish. And you won't be able to isolate your heats to as tight a spot. You're going to have a heat that's much longer. Whatever the size of the interior of your furnace is about the length of the heat that you're going to get. Whereas with a coal forge, you can get a smaller heat, a more localized heat. You can have a little bit better control of your atmosphere in your forge, so you can kind of control scaling. You're going to get a much quicker and deeper heat with coal as well. So having said that, I think they both offer advantages and some disadvantages. They're both really great. I use them both, and at this point, I kind of wouldn't want to have a shop that didn't have both. I'd like to have both for different reasons. I tend to like using propane if I'm doing long runs of similar items. Like when I'm making tongs, I kind of like to be able to do my tongs in a gas forge, set my my pressure where I need it to get the heating that I need in between heats, so I don't get excessive scaling, but I can forget about the other half, and I don't have to worry about burning or heating. And then when I'm working on things like hammers and individual items that I'm not generally juggling between more than one billet, I like to use coal. And I like to use solid fuels when I use strikers as well, usually just because I'm doing bigger work and it's easier to get the heat that I need. So, you know, there's whatever you need for whatever your goals and your situation are, they both work great. So, you know, from there, you can kind of decide whatever makes the most sense for you.
So one more question. What do you look for most in your transitions to make sure they're good?
Well, let me get this to where I have a good example. So I look for having, first off, I want the transition on the offside. I want to make sure that I've aimed, well, both sides really, but it's a little bit of a difference in technique. I'm aiming with my heel here and I'm aiming with my toe here of my hammer. And sometimes, you know, people tend to favor one or the other and find one to be easier to actually execute than the other. So seeing that those match is really good, because that means that you have a little bit better command of your hammer. I like to see a similar amount of weight coming out of even though this is the bigger end of the hammer, even though this is a peen on this end and this is a face on this end, I want my transitions to be the same, because it makes the hammer look like the two go with each other, makes them match. So I want the width to be equal from one side to the other. I like to see nice curving transitions out. I like to have a good balance between curved lines and straight lines and have some harmony between the two. So I like to come in here and make sure that I've got a nice, pleasing curve on my concave transitions out. And then other than that, I like to see all of my chamfers to be equal in, you know, if you were doing drawing, a good analogy would be line weight for your pencil or pen lines or brush strokes. You know, you have a similar weight between all of your chamfers. So I'd like to see that those are the same width all the way around. I'd like to see more or less perfectly straight edges coming out. So if I put a ruler on all 4 sides and turn it full 360, you know, I want all of my edges to be straight, and all of my chamfers to all line up on straight lines. So those are the things that I'm looking at. Of course, this is only one style of hammer, so, you know, I could probably comment a little bit more about other styles, but anyway, I don't know if that answers the question fully, but those are the things that I look for. And then again, it's not just about the transitions, because the faces are the one half of the transition and the eye is the other half. So a lot of people will get carried away and they'll only pay attention to the face, or they'll only pay attention to the peen, and they just leave a lumpy blob here in the middle. and then they go, geez, my cheeks, they sure do look all funky and, you know, lumpy, and then they've got a lot of file work to do. So, you know, if you want to be able to have something that is what I call off the hammer, where, you know, you don't have any work to do, then doing any work to it, that's an aesthetic decision. It's not a necessity because you need to correct poor forging. So, so anyway, I hope that answers the question. Any others?
I don't have any more. And yes, she said that was great, plus an exclamation point. So there you go.
Awesome.
That
Okay,
was
good
Anna.
to hear. All right. So, okay, so we've got the faces. Now we've got to start drifting. This is square stock. So you can drift through your hardy hole, but you need to make sure that you're drifting evenly. So you need to, I don't know if it's a word, I call it joggling. I think I've heard that by other people, but you just go from the one corner of the hardy hole. This allows you, especially if you got a hardy hole that is narrower on its width than your punch, the diagonal is longer, so you can still manage to fit your drift in there. You turn it sideways, plus you got more support the way that the corner supports the ends of the hole there. It supports it better. And then you go from one side to the other, you go back and forth with each successive hammer blow, and that keeps your stock from wanting to sink down and get pushed down into the hardy hole and cause it to get bent. Now, I drive my drifts only as far as I need, even when I'm using a through and through drift. A through and through drift's designed to be kind of forgiving in that you can kind of drive it in there and you can go and do fullering, or, you know, use a cross peen to draw your cheeks out. But I like to leave myself a little bit of opportunity to drive more drift in. I don't need to drive it all at once. And what I find is that you have a little bit better control of your stock if you don't drive it all the way in. What happens is if you drive your drift in, you stretch your material, and your drift eventually will be pushing the stock outward. But what I want to do is I want to do a controlled draw. So I don't want to continue to drift it beyond the point that I can see my drift fit. In this case, you can see there's a little bit of a gap between the drift and the hole. I drive my drift to where it just starts to snug up, and you usually know you're there because the drift will act like a heat sink, and you'll see a dark line or a dark edge on these corners here as the heat starts to get pulled out. That's a good indication that you have a full contact between your cold drift and your hot steel. And I stop right there. I don't go any further. I give myself some opportunity to drive that drift more. And you'll see the reason why in one of the future frames here. Before we go on, proper handling of a hot drift. You don't want to be, you know, you certainly don't want to touch it with your hands. They get very, very hot very, very quickly. So you don't want to touch them. And you don't want to be fumbling around with tongs. So what you do is you bring the drift towards your shelf, right? Your shelf gives you a spot where you can back your stock up to it, and you can drive your drift off. So you're gonna start close to that. You put your business end down on your drift, and you alternate your blows from one side to the other. That keeps your stock getting driven off evenly and keeps it from bending. And once it's free, you'll position your stock here, your stock here off the shelf, or on the shelf rather, with the drift on the table, and then you drive the drift off. And then it's in a working position where when you come back with the stock and it's hot, you just do that all in reverse, and you don't need to fumble around with your drift. When you're drifting the eyes, you have to realize that using a peen or using a fuller, it does direct the draw of metal. And what I mean by that is by having a narrow radius and long edge, you're going to push your stock generally so that it's in line with the drift. You're going to get height on your eyes, and you're not going to get a lot of width on your draw. But you can't eliminate the width entirely. You can't direct the steel 100% where you want it to go. You can just get closer to that 100% mark. And what will happen is you're going to get some elongation in your eye. What I mean by that is you can see in this picture, when the forging on this picture started, even though this is marks, I know from experience, you would have had contact all the way around here. And then as you continue to draw it with your fuller, you get this elongation, this gap. Now, the reason why I don't drive my drift all the way in is because as this hole elongates, I can drive a little bit more of my drift in, and it fills this eye, and it prevents that elongation from getting out of hand. So you're just going to focus on even forging when you do this. And what I mean by that is you want to control the amount of draw in a methodical and consistent approach. When you're working on a drift, in this case, it's a through and through drift, so you don't have to be as particular. But if you're working on a taper, oftentimes you don't have any support on the business end side of the drift. Because you have a taper, it'll be snug on the top, but then there won't be any support to the drift on this side. And if you hit where you don't have support, you'll just collapse your eye. So you want to keep your forging on the center line. You want to go from the center towards the struck end of the drift. This is whether you're doing a through and through drift or a handheld. And then you start by making a bit of a trough or valley here. And then you start to work into your lump, your mass here. But you don't want to try to focus only on one side at a time, because you have your anvil is going to act as a heat sink, and it's going to draw all the heat out of this side of the stock. And you want to have even forging. So you want to do a little bit on one side and flip your stock, and then you want to do the same exact thing on the other. In this case, you can see that's been done. And even though the drawing is only partly finished here, you can see that the thickness from one side of the eye to the other is pretty equal. And that's the end of the heat ready to drive that drift off. Then from there, you're going to work on the opposite side. So I generally draw off the middle and then towards the business end, and then I'll flip it and do same thing from the other side. In this picture, this is kind of a finished draw, and now at this point you're all the way up on this parallel side, so you can kind of work through the whole thing. I tend to stick to my routine you'll see in the video, but this is totally an acceptable way of doing it. There's no right or wrong way. There's just preference based upon experience. The reason why I like to do it that way is because I can mitigate how much this will happen. And if you get a lot of elongation, what this is evidence of the earlier hole, not only the original punched hole, but what happens is when the eye elongates and it no longer has support, then it's gonna drive around the edge of the drift, and it's gonna just collapse this. If you keep going, this just turns into a cold shut down in there. So I don't like for that to happen. So I tend to leave a little bit of drift for later. But if you do get this, if you get this elongation, then you can drive your finished drift in and you can clean that up, which is a step you'll be doing whichever way you like to do it. You can use this, you can do this without a bolster. And when you do this without a bolster, you're driving a drift into the eye. And it's not as manageable as a bolster. You don't have support on both sides, which means that you need to try to match the radius of the convex radius of your horn to the concave radius of your transition as close as you can, so that you've got as much support as possible. And then you need to alternate from the one side to the other. So you're going to go to the off side of the anvil and then the near side of the anvil, alternating your blows. Otherwise, you're going to tend to want to bend whichever side you're using for support. So having said that, I prefer to have a bolster. You will not regret making bolsters. And the bolster in this case is 1.5 inch half round swage. So I've driven that in, and right now you can see from this view, I'm going to hit from the center line. I'm going to make a valley, and then I'm going to work towards the business end here. I worked on the one side and I did that, and you can see there's a gap starting to open up in there. So you can see I'm only working on just the half, and I'm turning my stock as I go so that my forging remains consistent and even. And I think about driving it, and then I think I should show this for the camera. So I've got a little bit of a gap there, and then I'm going to drive the drift, and then that gap will go away as I drive that drift in and get a little bit more of the mass of the drift in there. So you can see I've cleared the drift in a way that I can do a hands-free re-entry. And I'm just continuing to focus just on that one side only. And here you can see it. I've only worked from the center line to that side, and you can see the edge marking from the hardy hole. So to protect the previous forging that I've done, I'm going to use my bolster, and you'll notice I don't bury that drift in there. I've left more mass to drive in, and it's the same thing, but now you'll notice, well, it's snugged in there pretty well, but oftentimes you'll have a gap on this side because you're driving a tapered tool from the opposite side of where you've already had a big end go in. So you sometimes don't have the support, and you don't want to crush that. So now I'm all the way up onto the parallel sides. I like to have the proportions for this hammer. You will have a circular, you'll have circular cheeks that have a diameter of about 1.5 inches if you've done it correctly. And if you have good conservation of material, the thickness of your cheeks will still be about 1/4 inch. So again, here I am kind of clearing this drift off. I tend to kind of baby it off because I don't want to bend my stock. Now, getting back to the earlier point, we're kind of going in reverse from a store-bought hammer handle. And I have that 1 1/16 inch requirement for this to fit. So I'm finding now I have a taper drift, and this is the drift that I'll use for finishing my eye and for putting an hourglass interior profile into my eye. And what that does is you have a pinch point in the middle. So I've gotten my proportions so that this will match the dimensions that I want my eye to be. And I measure from the bottom, not the peaks of those cheeks, but the valley down in there. Now I'm going to work on, there was a little bit of evening that I want to do. I want to make sure that the height, if I look down lengthwise, the height of my cheeks are the same. And this cheek was a little shorter than the other one. So I did a little bit of drawing, but for the most part, I'm using the flat side of my hammer to take all of my marks out from drawing. So you can see that I've maintained a position. Now from the other side, this is the narrow side, this is the underside. So now I'll have a narrow point in the middle, but you can see there's a gap on the underside, and that's what's going to cause a good secure fit. And I don't want to pinch that gap, so I'm keeping my hammer blows up here past the halfway mark. At this point, you can part this thing off of the bar, and you can just handle this thing on the drift. Your hand can be managing the stock on the handle of the drift. And to release a handheld drift, driving it off and letting the momentum of the stock carry the work down is a good way to get the drift off. So for the cheeks, and this is just as a reminder, hammer blow position, that's really important. The cheeks are going to be 1.5 inch in diameter, say 3/16 to 1/4 of an inch thick here. And then your transitions, I like to be able to see a circle by the time I'm done. That's why I was so meticulous about getting those transitions in the first place, because I don't want to have to go in there and clean them up with a file. For the certification for both the CBA and for Abana, you cannot use a grinder. You can grind on the faces because that's finishing faces and that's reasonable. But this is to measure your ability at forging a hammer. So using a file is okay, but having said that, more is not always better. The idea is to get as close as you possibly can forging, so that filing is either just absolutely to a minimum or not necessary at all. I included it in my video just because I want to kind of show how to go about it. So
John, we have a question.
Sure.
Can you use hump tools instead of a bolster? And maybe a quick description of hump tools, the two pieces.
Yeah, hump tools are basically, if you have, well, here's a bolster. So if you can imagine, a hump tool would be supporting to either side with 2 individual tools with a span in the middle, and the hump tools will support underneath or to either side of the eye, and you just kind of line them up at the appropriate width. Now, I like that when I have narrow troughs, but if I have long faces and, like nice big round cheeks that are very proud of the transitions, you can see that these are quite a bit taller than what is adjacent to them. I like to use a bolster for those types of things. So hump tools I like to use for hammers like American style or Brazil Brothers style rounding hammers that have fullering that is adjacent to the eye. If I was to do hump tools in this case, they would be very, very shallow humps. I mean, they would be, almost flat out here, and then they would just be radiused to maybe, I don't know, 5/8, 3/4 inch radius right here as it transitions down into the sweep. But you could. I just don't think that I would prefer that for this type of hammer. Anybody else before I move on?
Nope, looks good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Now the trade or the touch mark doesn't only mark your work. It also gives you a indicator of what side is up. The last side that you went through with the big side of your drift, that is the top side of your hammer. That's the side that you're going to drive your wedges into. So when you're fitting a secure hammer, you will have an hourglass shape in there. It'll be wide at the top from either side. It'll have a pinch point in the middle, and then it'll widen again. And the underside, the shoulder will snug in there with a taper, and that prevents the hammer from being driven down onto your handle. And then the top side will have a wedge, usually at least a wood wedge and often a metal wedge driven into the top, and it's trapped. It can't go up, it can't go down. But you need to know which side's the top. The last side that the drift went through will be the larger side, and you want to orient your touch mark so that it is in a reading position, so that the side that has the wedges driven in, that's the top side. Also, I get to show you guys my touch mark. So, evaluation after you're all done here, you've got to see, did you make the hammer that you were trying to make, right? So this hammer had a little bit more pitting than I'm usually used to. I think I was probably distracted with video. which by the way is a new experience for me. So thank you guys for giving me the opportunity to do this, because it's making me learn, and I really appreciate that. It's kind of pushing me as well as hopefully helping you guys out. You want to make sure that your stock is, there's a little bit of a poor orientation of the straight edge here, but you want to have from the center of your peen, you want to bisect your eye and then bisect all the way to the face. So you're running a straight center line all the way through. And then from the side, you want to do the same. If you start getting into modeling hammers, that sort of thing, you might have a downward curvature, but those are more for sitting positions for things like hammer and stake repoussé and that kind of work. This is still a forging hammer, and you're going to be in a standing position, so you're going to have this pretty much straight. You're going to have your 1.5 inch circular diameter here. I like to see my transitions. This hasn't been filed at all yet. I like to see the termination of my two forgings where they meet basically describe a circle in here, and then the face should be a true inch. All of my chamfering should be equivalent to and balanced from one side to the other. Your transitions are 3/4 of an inch, and then your peen end when finished is 1 inch 3/8 by 1, as you can see here. And then another thing is you've got three inches from each face, from the eye to the end, with 1.5 inches in the middle. You end up about a 7.5 inch long hammer if you've done this well. So that leads us into grinding, finishing faces, handles. I think before we move on, does anybody have any forging related questions at this point? Because we're going to move into the latter half of the discussion, which is finishing your work and putting it on a handle.
What's the most common error you run into when drifting out the cheeks or getting the eye just right?
I think when I started, it was getting carried away with my drift. And that's why I'm so particular about it now. I think I would drive my drift way too far. I would start out with too big of a punched eye. And of course, when I started doing this, we didn't have a lot of the resources that we do have now. We didn't have Mark Asprey's books. We didn't have the Brazil brothers. We didn't have a lot of people doing this stuff. And I was basically approaching this from a trial and error based approach. So, early on, I had a tendency to use too big a punch. I was using a punch that was closer to the finished size of my eye. And my eyes were huge. I would drive the drift too far, too fast. And again, that would just contribute to an even larger eye. And then I think not cleaning up my transitions really well from the start, and being particular about, like I was saying earlier, I used to think of that as being a step to get the faces, but your transitions, half of that transition leads into the face and the other half leads into the cheek. And the thing that I had difficulty in the beginning is not realizing that I would have a tendency to sort of disregard that transition leading up into the mass where the cheek was, and then I would have very hit and miss results, and oftentimes I would be dissatisfied with the end result where everything looks like it's going really good, but what happens is everything shows up and becomes sort of multiplied right there at the end when you start drawing those things out. So if your transitions are really far away from your eye, then your cheeks end up really oblong and sloppy looking. If you don't transition up cleanly and work all sides evenly and get all of your forging even, then you don't have symmetry. So I think that those are probably my biggest issues. And having said that, just the biggest function question with eyes, and of course the cheeks are just the outside of the eye, it has to have a good fit for the handle when you're done. So you've got to maintain that hourglass shape in there to have a good secure head. That's the more important thing. A lot of the rest is aesthetics. a tall cheek does have a more secure fit, but part of it's visual. So anyway, long answer.
Do you find that students, when you teach this, that students tend to have those similar issues of the transitions not being as clean in the eye and going too far with the drift?
Yeah, I find that people learning tend to have things really spread out over the length of stock, and it's hard to keep everything tight and compact, and if you keep your forging tight and compact around the eye, then everything looks just so much like more together and tidy, when you're done. And like I said, things start multiplying, right? So they become more apparent the further you get into your work. It might look really good to start and you keep working on it and everything stretches more as you forge it more. So yeah, I definitely find that is true of students because they're not as confident with their tool placement. They don't have as much experience, but a lot of it's confidence. You don't want to, you just punched an eye, you don't want to crush it with your hammer. So it takes some confidence to lay your hammer blows down where you're just kind of clipping that edge. And it takes the experience of having accuracy and good form to facilitate a hammer blow that can get in there like that. So yeah, absolutely.
One more question. Do you have what's the taper that you have running on the drifts? Is it something specific or?
Thank you. Yeah. A 7-degree taper works really well for all kinds of securing things. It's a 7-degree taper is what's used for power hammer die keys, the wedge that you drive in, those kinds of things. And it turns out it works really well for hammers as well. So it's kind of hard to get that sometimes because what you're doing is you're doing a round taper and then taking it to a more or less oval. Brian Brazil calls it a pill shape because it's not necessarily oval. By the time you flatten your sides, it's got flat edges and then kind of round or flat faces and then rounded edges. But yeah, to try to get that to still be present, it's easy to do it on a round taper. By the time you flatten your sides out, sometimes you can lose that. But yeah, in the neighborhood of that works really well.
How do you find that 7 degrees? Is that take it off the power hammer taper or?
Well, I mean, in a practical way, 7 degrees is kind of hard to measure because it's not a very big number. So it's kind of like it's a goal you're shooting for, knowing that is going to be a secure fit. But, realistically, maybe you're going to get somewhere around 5. You don't want it to be in excess of that by very much, because now all of a sudden you got to start filling that with wedges. So, like I would err on the side of like under by a degree or 2. I mean, it's blacksmithing. You're doing it with a hammer, right? Unless you have machining equipment and the type of measuring equipment to be able to do that. So you're shooting for that. I think what I've found is that trial and error. I know how long I can draw my drifts before I flatten them out and they end up where I need them to be. So what I do is I try to sort of fit my forging into that formula of if I'm starting with like an inch, then I'm going to do a taper that's X long, and it's going to finish out at say 3/8 round at the end, right? So if it's say it's 5 inches long on the taper, and then it's 3/8 at the end. By the time I flatten that down, it's about right. So I'm kind of what I do is I measure the distance on the end and the length of the taper, and then I flatten that out. And flattening it out, of course, the more you flatten it, the more you alter your original taper. So there's a little bit of kind of practical experience and knowledge you have to gain through, doing it in the shop. Because even if I was going to communicate to everybody what I do in my shop right now, there's a good chance that you might not have the same drift as me. There's a very good chance. So, yeah. Anyway, I know that's probably not the answer that you want, but it's the answer that I have.
Anybody else have any more questions? I think we're good.
All right. So we're moving into the finish side of this. Again, this is mild steel. Here we go. I always turn my stock. I put it in into my platen here, and I turn it 90 degrees as I go. And that way I've got a good even turn. What happens is people tend to favor maybe a side or something, and then they, grind off at a slant. So by turning it, you correct your own errors. What I'm doing here is I'm doing a long grind and then kind of speeding up around the corner. So you'll see I'm going to, on the edge, I hold it for a second. Let me back that up. Long grind, and then around the corner, long grind, around the corner. I've got maybe a, 20-degree angle on there, 15-degree angle. What I'm doing is I'm putting a crown on there. I want to have an even grind on every edge. And this crown is to prevent a lot of marking on your stock. And let me pause this. To have a lot of marking on your stock and to prevent your blows from deflecting at odd angles on your rebound. So you can see it's, I'm looking at even grinding, like it's a little narrow there compared to the rest, but I've still got some work to do yet. And I'm going to do that shallow angle, maybe 15, 20 degrees. And I want to grind until I've come in about 3/16 of an inch or something like that. Depends on the size of the hammer, but that's pretty average for most hand hammers until you start getting to large sizes. Now that's your crown. But now you need to dress your edges. Otherwise, you've got sharp edges. The edges are a smaller grind, but at a 45. And this is like doing square octagon round. I don't want to go straight to having it round because I'm going to lose track of where I've done my grinding. If I approach this methodically and I have consistent grinding for my crown, for my face, and then I have consistent grinding for my crown, and then I have consistent grinding for my edges, all of that information is there. The mass is where it needs to be, and then you're doing a blend. So it's flat. What happened to my? There we go. Oh, hold on. Up to here, and it's all flat grinds to get the mass to the appropriate proportions, and then. So I've got a flat, a crown, and a dressed edge. Now I'm starting with it almost, not in, parallel with the belt, but a very shallow angle. And I'm grinding really lightly, and I'm taking off all of the little corners that I made. So as I go, I'm going to continue to change the angle of my hammer so that it goes from being almost in line with the belt to straight directly into the belt. In fact, I'm going to even go almost flat because I had little edges in the middle. I want those to blend too. And now you can see everything sort of blended together. Same thing with the peen side. I've got to make sure that I'm getting a good flat and even grind. In this case, I'm not turning it 4 different ways. I'm keeping it on its long axis and turning it 180 degrees. Excuse me. And then after I do that, I'm going to start profiling my edges. I want this to be a more or less round peen. Some peens for like drawing metal are sort of flat in the middle with crowned edges, just like a hammer face, but this is for leaf work. So what I'm doing is I'm getting my profile here. I hit my edges and I hit my corners, and now I'm hitting my edges on that edge, and now I do my blend. So turn it 180 degrees and 180 degrees. Now I've got to hit the corner, same thing. This gets turned 4 times. Twice, and then I'm going to reposition to the other edge and repeat. Now, everything is still sort of flat. And again, I'm going to get the material sort of where it needs to be. And then I start to blend. And just as with my other face, I'm starting with sort of flat grinds that gets the material where it is the appropriate dimensions. And then you have, just like with square, octagon, round, you've got all the little corners from the from the other edges. So you just keep going along and blending. As you can see here, I'm changing my angle as I go so that I end up with a rounded profile. Now, in this case, I didn't get carried away, but if I'm going to do tooling for, this is just for putting the sort of ruffles, if you will, in a edge of a water leaf using a crimping stake like Carol had shown when we were chatting in the beginning. So I'm not super worried about what you call die marking, leaving evidence of hammer blows on the edge. So, there's still a little bit of irregularity on both faces. If I'm going to be doing this for something like silversmithing work, or if I'm going to be doing this for some type of finished work where I'm leaving an impression, I'm going to clean this up a lot better. So I'll go through and usually I'll, take that down to sort of a bit of a mirror polish and then bring it back from that by hitting some scale for a little while, and it kind of works it out pretty well. So this is kind of fun. You're going to use a belt to we call it shoe shining, to clean up the sharp edge on the underside of your eye so that it doesn't shear your hammer handle down like a spoke shave. If you have a real sharp edge there, when you drive your hammer handle on from the end, kind of like, I know nobody smokes cigarettes anymore, but like if you're packing a pack of cigarettes, you drive it from the one end, but it affects the opposite end because of inertia and momentum. So you don't want it to shear. You don't want a sharp edge there. It shears it down, and then you don't have a snug fit. Instead of getting a fit which wedges, you just shear more, and it never actually wedges and fits securely. So you want to clean that up with a belt. And this is something Brian Brazil showed me. It's pretty cool. This is the sort of things that Brian notices. If you pull the belt towards you, it comes out nice and cool and straight. And this is what I love to see. This is great. That gets into the eye, and it's just a pleasure to work with. If you push away, you're gonna get a big, nasty curlicue. It is just the biggest pain in the butt to try to handle and everything. So you're going to put it through the eye, and now you're going to shoe shine. I think, here, let me take this volume down because I don't know if you guys want to hear the scratchy. But anyway, you go all the way around the edge, and what you're doing is you're putting a radius on the hammer, the edges of the eye, and that is so that it wedges appropriately. You've created an hourglass profile, so it has the ability to wedge. Then you have a good fit up on your handle, and you put a wedge into a wedge, hourglass eye. It wedges down, but not if it's got a sharp edge. Now, I generally don't do a lot of filing, and that's my head. But, I wanted to show, how you're going to approach this. In the first place, you want to do a minimal amount. And I'm doing all of the things that I was doing earlier with forging. I'm going to use the round side of the half round file when I'm in my transitions. And then I use the flat side when I'm on my cheeks. Put another way, when you're in a concavity, obviously you want to use the the round side, but when you're on a convexity, the flat side will have much better results than the round side. And then I'm going through and I'm going to take these edges off. And really what I'm looking at for this, the whole intent for me for this hammer, because it came out pretty nice and clean, is I just want to clean up these transitions here so that that line flows over to that line, and I've got an edge bevel that matches. So you can see I've done that here. And then, maybe a little bit of cleanup around your cheeks, but the idea is to get a nice, uniform look. You're not trying to finish your hammer. You're just kind of taking out the lumps. And then from here, I'm wedging, you can't see it here, but I'm wedging the faces into the open vise so that it stays put, so I can push against the vise and it's still secure even though I'm holding it in my hand. And all I'm doing is I'm now going, I worked on the eye first. Now I'm just transitioning that line right down into the face. So what I'm doing is connecting everything so that everything has a nice flow. And I don't have this on the video that's coming up, but anytime I do file work like this, if you have a butcher block brush, like horseshoers use, and a lot more blacksmiths are using those these days, those brushes that have the thick, the wide flat bristles, you get it to a little bit of, you get a little color in there, like a red heat, and you brush on your file work and it will blend it out very much like if you are doing like graphite drawing, and once you draw a line you use a blending tool or even a piece of napkin or your edge of your finger, it blends it all out and it takes the harshness off, and you won't completely get rid of that filed look, but it softens everything up. So anytime I use a file or a grinder that I'm trying to blend that work in with a forged look, I like to brush it at a fairly low heat. If you're too hot, you can scratch your work up with those blocks. The butcher block brushes are kind of aggressive. Some of this is going to be a little redundant, and more than anything, I want to have an opportunity to kind of talk about what you're going for the filing. But here in a second, I'm going to kind of show the profile and the dressed faces, just to kind of see the finish that I was going for, because it's helpful to see that finished result. And it was a pretty coarse file that I was using. You could use a file with a little finer tooth on it, and you can see the finish on the underside of the eye. Everything's still, nice and round. And then because it wasn't as good a view earlier on the grinder, you can see the faces and what you're going for. So, and I don't know why it does that. Okay, so we're on to hardening. Now this is case hardening, so this is kind of different from hardening if you're doing an actual tool steel. With case hardening, let's roll this. Case hardening, you've got a compound that's basically a flux with that acts as an oxygen barrier and a delivery for a compound which adds carbon at a very shallow surface level to the iron. And of course you need carbon for any degree of hardenability, but it's not a heck of a lot. Now this is not a hammer that's going to see a lot of real heavy work, but it's surprising how much it will add hardness to your work. You want to put it on at about a red, and you want to quench around a red, and so I'm not talking over my talking. You want to quench it when it's still a little wet, and you don't, because what happens is if you burn off your flux is your oxygen barrier, and as you know, when you heat carbon, you burn it off, and you don't have a lot there to begin with, right? So you want to have everything there that you need. So you're gonna get it to a cherry red color while it's still a little fluid, and you're gonna quench it while it's still got a little flow to the flux carrier that's in the case hardening material. And so you bring it right back to that heat, and then when you've determined, you're going to quench it, and you're going to agitate as you would with any quench. This is just ambient temperature water, and then with as you would with any steel, with any hardening process, you're going to test your hardness. So I like to clean the crust off because it leaves a little bit of a residue, and I don't want that to throw off my gauge of how well that file bites or not. And you're going to, you want the file to skate off. Sometimes you don't get a real glassy hardness with case hardening material. And you will notice the pitch change when you file a soft piece of steel. It's going to be a lower pitch, and it's really satisfying if you do thin pieces. You know, like when King Arthur draws Excalibur from the stone, and it makes the swing noise. If you get a good hard piece of steel, you get a cool swing sound. So that's kind of fun. And same thing with the peen end. The reason why I included the peen end, even though it seems a little redundant, is it's worth pointing out here. You've got a larger end here, and just strategy wise, you're not going to temper this stuff because it's a very thin surface level hardness, and it doesn't require tempering, and it's already not a real high degree of hardness to begin with. So it's not unsafe to leave it untempered, and if you temper it, you're probably going to lose a lot of what you were going for in the first place. So you want to start with the fat end, and then you want to go to the thin end. And onto handles. Okay, so before we go on, let's see, is there anybody that has any questions with any of the last two steps? Because I don't want to get too far through this. We've got the finishing and we've got the heat treatment, the case hardening. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I think we're
Okay.
good.
I was like, uh-oh.
Yeah, no, we're here. It just takes a while. I think Mike and I were racing to unmute ourselves.
Sure. Are we good on questions? Is everybody, was that quick?
How do you do each end of case hardening with propane?
That's a little harder, and I would. It depends on your forge. So if you can get a short heat, remember you're only trying to get the face, right? So if and you're not getting a very high heat either. So if you could keep the hammer out of the forge enough that you can isolate your heat only to the end. Remember, you're only getting kind of like a dark cherry color, and you're only working to the point that you don't want to get to the point where you've caused your case hardening compound to dry. You might be able to squeak it in there with a gas forge, especially because we've got a little bit of a longer hammer here, and you might not get a sufficient amount of heat to the other side to to make that a problem. The other thing is definitely make sure you do your face first and then the peen. It's even more critical in propane. Now, if I really had to and I couldn't get any of those things to work, could be a little trickier. I have a 2-burner forge, and the way that I would do it with a 2-burner forge is I would do both faces at the same time, and I would put my faces under each burner. So in other words, the eye and the cheeks would be between the 2 burners, and I would try to, and of course it doesn't matter if they get hot or not, they don't have carbon. Okay, so you're really looking for balancing your heat between the 2 sides, and then I would do a single quench, and it would be trickier to do. Now, if you don't have a 2-burner forge and you're using a single burner, probably your best bet is to try to do one side at a time. And if you were really, really having problems, the only way that you could probably get away with doing that, have it come out right, is to be spinning your stock as you go. But you'd have to be basically turning it kind of like a rotisserie chicken, And I do that with coal too. Like when I'm working on hammers, for instance, and I'm heat treating in coal, I'm flipping my hammer faces so that I heat my hammer faces individually, more like you would do like a torch hardening. So it can be done. It just takes a little bit more management, and it's going to be a little harder to do.
Okay, I think that's all we have.
Is that it? Okay.
Yep.
So the way that Mark, laid this out is to be able to use a store-bought hardware store handle, and that's super convenient, especially if you don't have maybe you don't have a belt grinder. You can't, just take for granted that everybody has access to these things. If you do, then it is a great tool, and a lot of lumber suppliers carry hardwoods, and you can go and you can get hickory in planks. If you know anybody that has a table saw, you have a table saw yourself, you can rip those down. I usually do like about a 16-inch cut, and then I rip it into pieces, and I'll have they measure it in quarters. So 4/4 is an inch. I always get the 5/4. For some smaller hammers like this, you can do 4/4. So it's a 1 inch wide. And then I'll rip that down at 1.5 inches. So it's 1.5 inches this way. And then this one was 1 inch here and worked out just fine. If you want to have a lot of shape to your hammers, you just have less opportunity to get that if you start with a smaller stave. But the way that I do this is I use some rules of thumb, because I've been making hammers for long enough that I don't like to fuss with things. And so it takes a little bit more work, but this is the way that I do it, and it works really well for me. I grind, again, kind of a square octagon round approach. I grind bevels. These are just visual references. This is just to get the size of the end where it needs to be. So I go widthwise and I grind a little bevel on each side. And then once it matches, I know it's going to fit. Of course, it's going to be a rectangle, and I'll have to take corners off. And I'll do the same thing this way, get my width. So these bevel grind lines, those are just to get my starting point for my rectangular grind. Well, then I've got to grind in, and I've got to put a shoulder in here. The shoulder is down here. That's where you get your wedge on the underside. Now, all I do is about, 3/4 of an inch below your hammer handle. I just put my finger there, and now I connect the dots. I go on the swoop on the wheel, and I actually start from this end and I grind down until I get to my finger, and then I can turn it and match up the other sides. Once you've gotten your roughed in flats, so it's rectangular with a shoulder, you hit your edges, and then you kind of spin it in your fingers and you get it rounded out. I wish I had a video for you guys. I apologize. We took video and it got corrupted, and so I had to use our photos for this. But I think it's a good enough visual representation where you can see how you do this. So I call this the neck here. The neck goes into the eye, and then you've got your throat. That's the section that transitions out of your shoulder. Here's your shoulder here. So you bring your throat up to your shoulder. So your neck goes to the shoulder, your throat goes to the shoulder. And you're kind of going square octagon round as you go. And I like to have this throat here, say in the narrow section, 2 to 3 inches. And I like for it to be a little narrower than my eye, because I want that to be able to flex and have some give, so I don't have shock going into my eye and causing it to crack or shear across the head. This actually acts a little bit like a spring, takes some of the sting out of the hammer blow, and prevents your hammer from breaking, provided you don't excessively thin it. And then, very much like with my forging, I like to start with stop points and finish points. So you can see, I'll go back. Sorry. I've got a start point and I've got a finish point. So I connect my dots. And then I've got a start point. And then in the next one, we didn't have a picture of it, but I did my profile for my heel. This is the heel of the hammer here. Some people call it the swell. So I've got a start point and a finish point, and I go from my throat to my heel or to my swell, and I'm going to shape my grip to where it's comfortable in my hand. And then once I go square to octagon, then I'm going to spin it on the platen and in any concavities, spin it in those to get it rounded out. And if you're good, you know, you can get it where you don't need a lot of cleanup, but sometimes you'll need to go with some, you know, like a file or sandpaper or whatever. And this just kind of, maybe when you're starting, you get it roughed in. And it takes some practice. I'm not saying that this is easy. It took me a long time to develop my techniques. And then it took me, and this is how I do it. I don't know how other people do it. This is what I kind of developed, bought through trial and error. Oops, excuse me. Through trial and error, because it was out of necessity. But it works well. I've taught a lot of people how to do it, and it works for them too. Then you're going to cut. It's called a kerf. A kerf is just a cut into a piece of wood, and that's where your wedge is going to fit. You can see I fit my hammer handle onto my head. Now you can see where it's touching the insides of the eye, and you can see a little compression mark here on edge and then on the side here too. And if you can't get it to drive all the way through the eye, you'll have these marks, and that gives you a visual reference of where you need to grind it to thin it. You want to have it touching all the way around so you have a good fit, and you can drive it on, look at your marks, the compression marks, and then drive it back off, and then you can fine tune it to fit your eye so you get a good fit until it exits the eye at an appropriate point. I like to have it like about a 1/4 of an inch out of the eye. And then you're going to cut in your kerf. And now you can see here, this is a good example down here on this side. You can see the compression marks here and here. And you can actually, if you look real close, you can see a little bit of a swoop up. That's where the cheeks swoop up into that little termination where it's actually entering the eye. And I don't want my kerf to go any lower than that, because otherwise it's sticking out the bottom side of my hammer. In fact, here's my mark for where it needs to fit. You can have it up above that, because remember, this is going to be wedging on the underside of a pinch point. And then when I'm done cutting my kerf, I like to either use a triangular file or the edge of my belt and put a little bit of a V, and that's an entry point for my wedge. Because once this gets driven into a hammer eye, if it's got a real tight fit, it'll close up your kerf and you won't be able to get your wedge in. And then you're trying to drive a little chisel in there or something to, you know, get it to fit, and then it's a pain in the butt. So this is cutting the kerf. If you're going to cut, you can use a vertical bandsaw, and that works really well, and you can get a good straight cut without a lot of fuss. If you don't have that, you want to use a hacksaw, and you don't want to try to just go straight to it. You want to cut down the center this way, and you're going to flip it. I'll describe outside of the context of the video. Let me start this over. You start on a corner and you line your line up so that it's going down this edge. And once you get that going straight, then you go down the front. Now you've connected your points, and now you extend your cut this way. Now you'll still have a lump in the middle, so then you take your saw perpendicular to the cut, and you cut down to your line that you've established. So you cut your kerf to the right depth. What is this? Oh, making a wedge. Okay, so I like to make my wedges. I'm doing a taper. I'm gonna pause this or go to the beginning. I'm doing a hard hit and a soft hit. Hard, soft. So I'm gonna get a wedge. Now I'm gonna hang a little bit over a sharp edge and push and get my teeth. And I'm gonna do a little cleanup. And now I'm gonna take a hot cut and I'm gonna part this off. I'm gonna find my mark where I want it to go. Now I'm gonna tilt this because it's a double bevel hot cut. I'm gonna tilt it so that this edge is perpendicular to my anvil. So I get a straight cut here and an angled cut there. So this side has a 90-degree cut on it by angling my hot cut. Then I'm going to take that and I'm going to part it off of the bar. Now I've got my wedge. Additionally, the nice thing is this cut gives me a sharp edge. And when I make wedges, I just make a bunch at a time. I've got a sharp edge on that side, and that starts my wedge for the next wedge. It gives me a sharp edge on the other side. So I've got to, you just keep going with them. And they're quick, you know, they don't take me hardly any time at all. So now for the fitting and wedging, you're going to, I like to glue my wood wedge. This was a piece of pressure treat. Would not recommend, but I forgot my wedge at home when we did the video, so I did a piece of pressure treat. And it worked just fine. You can see that on this picture, it filled the kerf really well. So I glue it, and I put a little glue across the kerf, and then you drive the wedge in. I like to actually drive a little bit, and I like to hold my hammer in my hand when I drive, and I don't like to brace on the anvil because I can split my hammer handle that way. You can split the heel, just drive a big split all the way up your handle. So I don't like to do that. I like to hold it in my hand and then hit on the wedge. The only time that I like to brace on the anvil, I actually put this wedge split before I could get there, but I'll put the end of the wedge on the anvil and I'll hit the heel of the hammer. You can get a pretty good secure fit that way, and you can really compress the material where you actually see that wood compressing around the edges of the eye. That's a good thing. And you're going to grind the excess off. I like to clean the glue off before I put it on the belt, because otherwise you'll gum up your belt and it won't be as sharp later. And then the metal wedge, you want to go crosswise. I'll either go crosswise, and that will fill the gaps in the sides if there are any. You can also go diagonally, and it will actually push on all edges of your eye. And if you plan on having another wedge down the road, I put them in the middle and straight for aesthetics, because otherwise people go, well, you know, you got your wedge is crooked and it's not in the middle, and then you got to tell them a big story, and I don't like to do that. So I just put it in there so that it's square and I don't have to have a conversation about it. But if I wanted to be looking forward for getting the most life out of this hammer handle as I can, I put them in at an angle and I put them off to one side. That pushes on all edges, and it gives me room over on the other side to put another wedge when this thing starts to loosen up. So, you know, 5 years down the road, when this thing's swollen and shrunken and swollen and shrunken from humidity fluctuations, and it's my favorite handle of all time and I love it, and it starts to get a little loose, I get to extend that, you know, working life out of the thing a little bit longer. And I give myself some room to do that without piling wedges up on top of each other. And this is driving the wedge on, and you can see I'm holding it in my hand. I'm not bracing it. And then the middle one, I must have been pausing for a photo there, photo opportunity. So I get it started, and then I have it in my hand. You really don't want to brace that. You don't want to go through all of that, and you've got everything literally stuck, you know, in the middle of your eye, and then you split it, because that just really sucks. Okay, I think we're kind of, oh, I don't know why it does that. Okay, and then there you go. That's the finished hammer. This is just kind of out of the forge, brushed with a butcher's block. You can see that butcher's block really cleaned up those transitions where you can hardly even see my file marks. I didn't worry about doing a lot of finish work beyond that. I think it looks really pretty nice just as it is. And yeah, and the splitting that I'm talking about, you'll grab a little bit of a corner here and you'll just peel that thing and you just split it right up the handle. So that's why I don't brace it. And yeah, that is it in its complete form.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you, John. If people want to unmute themselves, I know we've run right up against our 2 hours here, but if anybody has any questions, go ahead and unmute yourself. We can see your face on the video, and we'll have a little discussion. I'm sure we can get John to stick around a little longer.
Oh yeah, I'm good. You know, I'm here for you guys.
So why don't you stop sharing and then everybody can see each other.
Stop share.
Yeah, perfect.
All right. Anybody want to throw some curveballs at me?
John, what do you use to finish the handle now that the raw wood? Do you just oil on it, or what do you put on there to?
Yeah, the way that
finish
I've
it up?
always liked to do that is I like to use a plumber's torch. So, you know, you get your rough grind and then you might have some ridges. You want to run your hands over it, make sure you don't have any spots that are going to bug you down the road. It's amazing how just a little point of a grind, you know, where two grinding planes come together can really kind of irritate you. So maybe sand it or whatever, just kind of, you know, get everything smoothed out. And then I use a plumber's torch and I just take it to where there's just a little bit of a char. I don't want to have charcoal on it. I don't want to have any kind of powdery dust come off of it later, but and I'll go over the whole thing evenly with a plumber's torch, like you would use like a you know, like a paint gun. And then while it's still hot, it's a perfect time to put boiled linseed oil on it, because what will happen is you'll drive off the moisture and it'll be warm and it'll just suck a huge amount of boiled linseed oil into there, like really, really well. If you want to get a real, you know, deep linseed oil finish, you know, you can put it in a bucket and soak it for a week or whatever you want to do. But I don't have that kind of patience. So I get it warm. I put the linseed oil on there. I let it suck it up until it doesn't want to, it'll bubble and it'll just keep sucking up linseed oil. I rub it on until it won't take anymore. And then I just kind of let it, you know, drip dry, hang dry for a while. And then I'll clean it off with a rag. And I use the horn of my anvil, and I'll grab my hammer handle in one side and my heel on the other, and I'll rub it with some force on the horn and I'll burnish it. And burnishing it really puts a nice glassy finish on there that it's smooth, it's attractive. It also doesn't slip a lot in your hand. And that's pretty much how I've finished all my hammers for like 20 years, and they hold up really well. You might want to, you know, frequently, you know, not frequently, but every once in a while, put a little coat of linseed oil on there to keep them good. And nice thing about boiled linseed oil is it's a hardening oil. It does not harden from evaporation. It hardens from oxidation. So it doesn't lose volume. So, and one thing I should say about the plumber's torch is if you've got green wood or any kind of moisture in there, it'll crack your handle. So you've got to have a kiln dried piece of wood to do that. But once you drive off your moisture, or if you have a good dry kiln dried piece of wood and you get the boiled linseed oil in there, it polymerizes in the pores. So it's occupying that space. There's nowhere for water to get into it to swell. And, you know, so, and because it hardens from oxidation rather than evaporation, it doesn't lose volume. So it fills up those pores. And then once oxygen interacts with it, it polymerizes, and you basically got kind of a resin impregnated handle, and they hold up really, really well. And they wear really nice too. If you use them for a while, they go from having that like dark, you know, charcoal finish to them, like rich brown finish. But then where you handle them, they'll get glassy like old rails or banisters will, you know, and they kind of get that starburst kind of look, or sunburst look, like Gibson guitars, you know. They're really, it's pretty, you know, it looks good just from work, just from use.
Thank you, John.
You're welcome.
So I've seen, I saw you tore the strip for the sandpaper. But I've seen, my mom has somewhere for wood turners, they actually sell small strips of sandpaper like that.
Cool.
In rolls.
Cool. Yeah.
So they come with like multiple rolls and you can just tear it off.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, if you've got a belt grinder, I use my belts. So I graduate my belts from being for handles, and they only will be used for wood. And when they start to lose their bite, then I start using them to do finish work on metal where I want to do a nice finish. And once they lose the bite for that, then they get used for things like deburring and that sort of thing. And when they start to become, useless for that, then they get torn into strips and then they turn into shoe shine belts. So, you get a lot more use out of your abrasives. And I have to say, being a professional tool maker for a long period of time, one of the reasons why I started trying to do real nice finishes is because abrasives are expensive. And, like one of your primary costs for this type of work, especially if you're doing any kind of ground finish at all, it's all of your consumables. So, so I started doing it for that reason, conservation of materials and supplies. But yeah, that's great to mention.
Yeah, that's a great idea.
Yeah, well,
make your belts last longer.
Yeah, well, as a farrier, I do that with my rasps too. They go from only touching a hoof to finishing a hoof to using on hot rasping, and then they become like usually something a blacksmith makes. Usually I give them away to people and they have projects, but it's nice to get more than one use out of something.
A lot of folded axes coming out of the old farrier's rasps.
Yeah, absolutely. Snakes and spurs and all kinds of things. Anybody else?
Well done. Done.
Thank you.
Okay, well, go ahead. Go ahead, Kelly.
John, I would just echo, like, man, great presentation on this. Thanks for putting all that work into the front side of this thing. I know it wasn't easy.
Oh, thank you, Kellen. I appreciate that. And good to see your smiling face, by the way, man.
So good to see you, man.
Yeah,
I'm going to give you a call tomorrow. I'd love to catch up.
Oh, that'd be great. And that goes for all of you guys too. It's really good to see, I don't know everybody here, but it's good to see everybody, meet the people I don't know, and see all the people that I do, because it's been a little bit. So,
Well done.
Yeah, thank you. Well, yeah, and if you have any questions to come up later, you can always get a hold of me, and I'd be happy to answer them.
Thanks, John. Did a great job.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, John. Great demonstration.
You're very welcome. My pleasure. Thank you, Becky.
John, I'll ask a quick question. So
Sure.
when you're doing your final drive for your drift,
Mhm.
and since the top eye is larger for your wedge,
Mhm.
how far do you go? Maybe I missed that. Maybe you already said that.
I just go a hair below the other one. I have my mark on there, and I make sure that I'm getting it to the size of hammer, to match the hammer handle. I'll drive it maybe 1/8 of an inch below, just to make sure that I have a definitive top and a definitive bottom.
Okay.
And then that way I've got a little bit more room for my wedge, that kind of thing.
Makes fitting your handle easier too, right?
Sure does. Yeah, it sure does.
Okay, can you hear me now? I got a
Yes.
question. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, I just figured out how to unmute my camera, so that's what took me so long.
You're
I'm
in
new
good-
at the Zooms, new at the Zoom stuff here.
Yeah, you're in good company. Me too.
Okay. I can't remember if it was probably 2 years ago. It might have been the spring conference in either Nevada City or Grass Valley
Mhm.
that we did the leafing hammers.
Oh, okay.
And when it came to the hard facing, if I remember right, I thought that Mark brought it up to red heat, put the flux on it, put it back in, brought it back up to a red heat, and maybe refluxed it and then went into the water with it. Does that
Yeah.
sound right?
Yeah, you can apply your hard facing compound. I would say up to 3 times. You might get a cumulative like effect.
Okay.
But you can't. At some point, you're just going to be wasting your hard facing or your, you know what I mean.
Yeah.
That
Hey, sorry,
compound, the compound, you're gonna, you're gonna have a diminishing returns return is what I'm saying. So up to 3 times, and I think I did 3 times on that hammer. One was because, well, each time is because I was really trying to get the pop, and I'm gonna admit to everybody, I don't use a lot of hard face or a hardening compound. And it seems like every time I work with Mark, he's got this wonderful, satisfying pop, and then I do the same exact stuff, and I don't get any pop, and I just am very upset about that. So yeah, I wanted to have some audio for you guys, and then so I did it more than once. But
I
yeah,
heard if you don't get the pop, that it just doesn't happen. Like your hammer's not hard.
well, you'll still get some hardness. I mean, it doesn't have to be super audible, but I have noticed that it definitely has a higher degree of hardness. If you have that audible pop, you really have nailed it, and that that's a real good sign that you've done it right. But that's not to say that it won't work if you don't get the pop. It's just it definitely helps. And from talking to Mark, who has a lot more experience with case hardening material, having it where it's still wet when you quench it is important for that audible pop. If it's dry and crusty, it's not going to do anything, so.
Also have to be wearing shorts.
And a little apron. Yes.
Yeah. Shorts
Absolutely.
and a little apron.
And you have to have the snip in the apron too. So absolutely.
Yeah.
I was wondering, how do you figure out what size cheeks you want on your hammer? Like what size is ideal?
Like in general, like as a general design consideration. I would say a lot of it is aesthetic. Having taller cheeks does provide a more secure, I've heard it called a house for the handle. You have more area in there to actually have a secure fit, right? But having said that, if you look at, say, a German style hammer, it has no cheeks at all. Of course, you'll tend to have a taller section through the eye, but you don't have true cheeks, right? So I would say that I like to see whatever those dimensions are. I'd like them to be 50% taller than the cross section, right? So if I start with an inch, I want to see 1.5 inches, and if I'm at 2 inches, maybe get to 3. You might not, you might not get there, right? But I want to be approaching that sort of relationship between my starting stock and my finished dimensions, because and I certainly don't want to see the reverse, where you'll see a lot of people, and this is getting back to the earlier question, like what was the biggest issue with cheeks when you started? First issue was I didn't have any. What I had was a really ugly punched hole, and I thought, well, that's good enough to put a handle in, right? And then you see people like doing like railroad spike axes, and it starts out as a 3/4 inch bar, but by the time they're done punching it, it's 1/2 inch. What's that going to hold? It's not going to do anything. It's just going to rock and teeter on that thing. And that was kind of like what I was doing when I started, right? So I at least want to maintain my original stock, but in general, I'd like to increase my stock by 25-50%. Good question. And having said that too, I think design's important. Just on another note, it's good to start thinking about like designing things based upon what you think are good design elements to meet the requirements of good tool function, and then decide what is it you like to see for aesthetics, right? So that you're putting your thumbprint on your work, right? What I like to do as a teacher is I like to teach people the methods so that it sort of empowers them to take the ideas out of their head and put it into a physical, representation of what they were trying to go for. So, so if you can wrap your head around what constitutes good design, and I think with hammers, the eye is definitely one of the major elements. And and then start playing with shapes. you know, and see if you can get something that looks cool and still works.
A key element there.
Yes, it has to work. David, I saw you raising your hand, but you're muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. It took me a second to get a handle on. So all this talk about proportions, and great job, by the way. I thought it was really informative and helpful. I'm about to get to that point of making my first leafing hammer. What would you say actually makes it a leafing hammer? I mean, is there something in between a cross peen and a leafing hammer? Is it just the proportions? Is there, at what point, what does it have to be a successful leafing hammer?
If it was shorter, it'd probably be like a Swedish cross peen, right? Yeah. And but you're talking about a hammer that's starting to get longer faces, that's getting into the realm of a repoussé hammer. So, which is why because now, so when you start looking at like repoussé, in particular, like hammer and stake repoussé, you're starting to work with at least the possibility of doing hollow forms. And now you've got to have faces that are long enough to reach into spaces for, having a lot of depth in your hollow form. So I would say that would be the difference between like a forging hammer. And then with a forging hammer, you're not working with a sheet stock or a thin stock. You're working with dimensional steel, and you want to have all the bulk concentrated closer to the hammer handle so that you're not losing a lot of your force by having diffusion from having smaller, narrower necks and things like that. You have a more compact shape, then you're going to retain a lot more of the energy for forging because you're trying to move stuff around more.
Concentrate the blow. So does it necessarily have to be kind of lighter weight to reach farther in and still maintain control if it were that long, but a heavier hammer?
I think it's that you start getting into kind of specialized hammers when you're talking about that, like when I was doing stake and hammer repoussé for some of my projects, I had to make a bunch of hammers that were specialized, just to get into little tricky areas and that sort of thing. And I think that this hammer is still leaning towards the proportions of a forging hammer, right? You could do some very light forging work with it, not heavy forging work. But with some repoussé, you're not you might be going for different effects, like you're using your hammer almost in as an alternative to like a chasing chisel, right? So rather than holding the tool in your hand and hitting it with a chasing hammer over like a pitch bowl or something like that, you're getting this a similar effect, but with the hammer. So yes, the hammers often end up being a lot lighter for, like, say, non-ferrous work, hollow forms, but then you have heavier versions when you start getting into armory and things like that. They're like the same hammer, but you're using thicker gauges and you're using ferrous material, so you have to have more weight to be able to get the material to move. So it just starts getting specialized. I don't know if that answers the question. Probably brought up a bunch more questions.
Great answer. Thank you.
Thanks. I saw somebody ask about measurements.
Yeah, so I just asked Beatrice, you think you're good on measurements? Does anyone need us to go back over those? I know early on I promised we would do that at the end, so I just wanted to check in and see if anybody needed that. Now,
I think I got all the measurements I needed. Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, okay, good.
I found my holes.
Okay, yeah, and I can just kind of rattle them off. Your measurements for finished proportions of the hammer when it's done. Mm-hmm. It ends up being about 7 to 7.5 inches long. Mm-hmm. And then the cheeks end up about 1.5 inches in diameter, with 1/4 inch, 3/16 to 1/4 inch sides on the eyes, on the cheeks. The transitions out of the cheeks are about 3/4 square.
Okay.
And then on the face side, it's a 3-inch long face that goes to 1 inch square.
Okay.
And the peen side is 3 inches long and it goes from 3/4 square to 3/8 thick by 1 inch wide.
Okay, yeah, I got that.
And you can be ballpark, but try to be close if you can. What were you saying, Victoria?
Mike Mumford, I think you had your hand up, or?
Yeah, it's been a long day, sorry, so I think maybe I slipped through something. You forged this on the end of a long bar, which I believe you said was 24 inches or something of that nature.
Yes.
Did you hot cut on the face, or what technique did you use to cut it off without distorting that?
Yeah, I didn't show that on any part of the tutorial or the video. You could hot cut it off, but I would recommend cutting it off with a chop saw or a bandsaw.
Okay.
Because you can get a cleaner, more perpendicular cut without any distortion. It's mild, so we cooled it off, and then we took it to the bandsaw and cut it off on the bandsaw.
That's what would happen in my shop, but I wouldn't.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if I was doing it off of a bar and using a billet, it probably would get cut on a bandsaw in advance of the forging as opposed to post forging. Yeah. There'd be a bandsaw involved in there somewhere. The only time that I like to hot cut is if I'm working with a striker and I can have a bottom hot cut and a top hot cut, because you have a much cleaner cut. But when you do that, you're going to have a crown on the faces, because it's going to cut a V. So when it parts off, it's not going to be a straight cut. There's sometimes where that can be an advantage, like on the round side of a rounding hammer, for instance. But in this case, it was a flat hammer, so it would have created more work than it would have, saved.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm having a
Thank you
great
very
time.
much.
This is
Very
fun.
nice presentation.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah.
Oh,
it was nice to see you guys.
Merry Christmas, Happy New Year.
Yep.
Yeah, you too.
Merry Christmas, everyone.
Merry Christmas, Happy New Year.
All
It's
right.
gonna be 2021 soon.
See you,
Unbelievable.
see you next year.
Goodness.
Isn't it just March?
We have high
Yeah.
hopes for this next year, right?
Yeah, let's get rid of 2020.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
2020, don't let the door hit you on the way out.
Right.
Agreed.
Bye,
All right.
everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Okay.
Bye, David.
Thanks.
Bye.
Good night.
Right.